Welcome to the Prosperity Podcast with your host, Brian Davey, focusing on economic empowerment in Northern Ontario. Join us for dynamic guests sharing ideas, stories, and news that fuel Indigenous business growth. Discover success stories and cutting-edge strategies to unlock the potential of Indigenous entrepreneurship. This is the Prosperity Podcast because when we grow together, we all prosper. Let's get started. Well, today we're going to be talking with CEO, President of NPI, that's the acronym for Northern Policy Institute, right?
Exactly.
And
put it on a hat, people start thinking you work for the police.
Exactly, yeah. So name Charles Cirtwill. Mm-hmm. And let's begin by just telling us a bit about yourself and the organization you work for.
Sure. So I've been living in Thunder Bay now for 12 years. I'm actually originally from Halifax. The evil background is I've got a law degree. Don't hold that against me, and a master's degree in public administration. So I specialize in program and policy analysis, which is pretty much what NPI does. We're what the professionals call a research institute or independent research institute. Most normal people just call us a think tank. And that means that we're professional troublemakers. We look at government policy related to road construction, taxation, healthcare delivery, education, and we say, okay, this is what you said you were going to try to achieve, and here's where you got to, and maybe here's some suggestions about how to fill those gaps.
Where does this data come from to answer those questions?
So that's actually been a pretty big challenge here in Northern Ontario for the last decade or so. We spent most of the first 5 years focused on trying to find information because the communities are so small and they're so spread apart. StatsCan is the principal source because, of course, they've got the census, which is pretty good and pretty reliable, but it only comes every 5 years. Then you got things like, surveys on business size, job employment. Every now and again, you'll get a call from StatCan saying, "Hey, are you working today? Are you expecting to work tomorrow? How much are you earning?" That kind of data comes to us. And then there's local surveys. So the cities have satisfaction surveys related to whether their services are acceptable or not. We ourselves got into the survey business. I really didn't want to, even though that's kind of my background. So we do a survey every 2 years around experience of racism in the big 6 communities in Northern Ontario. Pretty significant kind of findings around there, but it's hard to kind of get those in-person experiences, that lived experience, if you don't ask.
Yeah. And what was the reason for setting up the Policy Institute in the first place? What was the drivers that got that going?
See, now you're asking a question that depends on when I pick the point of history to start. So basically, the conversation's been going for probably 25, 30 years around how you make choices in Northern Ontario in particular. A lot of policy gets made in Toronto and Ottawa, right? A lot of policy gets made without even ever talking to the people who live here. And in lots of cases, what the leadership were finding when they were going to kind of push back against these kind of one-size-fits-all exercise was the governments will say, well, this is what the data says. This is what the data says. Well, of course, the data they're using is provincial data, which means it's Toronto, right? Yeah. Toronto's big enough that basically whatever happens in Toronto really influences the overall provincial trends. And so the leaders figured out pretty quickly that what they needed was something here independent in Northern Ontario looking at our numbers and saying, you know what, this might be what's happening in Toronto, but that's not what's happening in Fort Severn. That's not what's happening in Kenora. That's not what's happening in Ignace. And that's the challenge, right, is to make that point and have the evidence to back it up.
So you put out these reports after answering very important questions regarding Northern Ontario. And is it part of your role to gauge the impact it has on these reports as they're released?
Well, certainly the folks who donate generously to the charity that we are want to see some impact. So yeah, we measure things like how many people read it, how many people download it. We like to see how many times it's cited in the media. We like to see how many times it's waved around in various legislatures. It's always fun to watch that opposition MP wave that paper in the air and say, this is what they're saying up north. But we also look at things like actual changes in policy. So you look at changes to First Nations control of First Nations education, for example. That was the very first paper that MPI commissioned when we were created back in 2012. And out of the course of the next 3 years, you saw a lot of expansion in that area, a lot of citations of that paper in the work. So that's kind of fun to see. We've been spending a lot of time on transportation issues, a lot of time on immigration and population and welcoming issues around Northern Ontario. So just yesterday, both the Federation of Northern Municipalities and the Northwestern Ontario Municipal Association came out pushing for expansion of our road system, right? Moving it 2+1. Lot of talk about national projects, but very little talk about Northern Ontario as part of those national projects. We're a pretty big chunk of the country, and we weren't on the list.
Yeah. So you think then that NPI should be, or probably they should be, I feel anyway, that a large part of this data gathering or a vehicle that should be used to influence or put some kind of context around some of these larger projects that are being considered throughout Northern Ontario, don't you think? That
Oh,
makes
absolutely.
sense? Yeah.
Well, you take a look at, for example, the discussion that's happening right now about transportation. And we're talking about, we're going to build a corridor. We're going to build a national corridor through Northern Ontario. But there's no discussion about what that means for the First Nations that are there. There's no real prioritization of the existing challenges around airport infrastructure, how many times planes come into those communities and can't land or can't take off. Some of the federal rules that have been put in place to control how long a pilot can fly and how much rest they require, and that impacts your ability to get in and out of those communities. So here we're talking about, well, let's build a corridor so make it easy to get oil out of the ground in Alberta. Not that I object to getting oil out of the ground in Alberta and selling it to other folks. Totally okay with that. But there are ramifications for that, and the people who live here should be part of that conversation.
Yeah, especially when they're talking about a deep sea port in James Bay. I mean, that's going to have an impact on Northern Ontario.
Well, you know, when you're looking at the fact that Churchill is already there, it's a deep sea port. You know, it's an interesting conversation. And you're right. You know, think about the road infrastructure and the infrastructure necessary to get product to that port in James Bay, and then the impact it's going to have. Now, of course, there's positive and negatives of everything, right? And so that's the key, is to be able to understand how do you maximize the positive and how do you limit the negative.
Right. So tell us a bit about some of the, I read some of the Nation Rebuilding series. There was a number of reports there that was done. I thought they were excellent reports. What are some of the things that we should share with our listeners? Some of the key takeaways, maybe 3 or 4, that are so important that we should share here.
So that was a pretty intensive project. It was 3 years. We worked directly with 3 First Nations. A lot of kind of learning on both sides, I think.
You can name the First Nations.
Don't start me now.
Okay.
So it's, I didn't.
Or use the letters.
So it's AZA, BMI, and who was the third one?
Yeah, these are superior.
Now I'm going to get
Rob
calls
Superior.
from David and Tony saying, listen, pal, you can't remember the name. Anyway, oh, God. Put me on the spot, Brian.
Okay.
So, yeah, but, you know, there was 15 papers in that series, 2 of which only the communities have. The other 13 are public, available on our website. You can use that to your heart's content. And I think the key messages there were around economic opportunities and recognizing that, you know, you don't have to create own source revenue next door to where you live. You can put a resource in an urban center either in the region, or you can look at investing even farther away to generate those resources, because of course economic independence is independence, right? It's a powerful way to make sure you can make things happen. The other piece that came out of that was really the question of modern treaties, and the fact that, you know, it's time to update and strengthen those relationships, look more at kind of co-management kind of arrangements, shared sovereignty exercises. How do you get into the nitty-gritty of making decisions on the ground in a joint way, as opposed to one side coming to the other and saying, hey, we want to do this, and then the other side saying, well, you know, let's figure that out.
So taking the existing treaty, in this case it was Rob Superior, and then modifying it to include a more forward-looking, future-looking agreement. Is that
Exactly,
what you're
and of course you have to do that in stages, right? It's not like you can sit down and spend the next 15 years rewriting it, because in those 15 years there's going to be a whole generation that grows up and they have things that need to be dealt with. So you look at things like, can we change the rules around additions to reserves? How to make it simpler? How to make it more straightforward? How to make it easier?
Right.
And recognition. How to do urban reserves. Urban reserves was a big part of that project. One of the things that those 3 First Nations were looking at is, you know, they've got a dispersed population. Some of their land mass is a little bit farther away from economic centers. How do they go about taking advantage of some of the lessons that have been learned in Manitoba and BC around urban reserves? You know, there's communities in BC that generate millions of dollars in revenue from one building, just one building. And that's a model that we can use. In fact, I noticed that the Friendship Accord in Suluco just built or are in the process of building a residential apartment in Dryden. That's a perfect model of how to generate that own source revenue looking outside your natural landmass.
Okay, so what are I'm trying to figure out how, in regard to own source revenue or revenue sharing, there were some, I believe some of the papers were focused on that, right, to some extent. So what were some of the key aspects that were uncovered when doing that part of the project or survey?
So there was a couple of interesting things. One was, every time that there's a arrangement between Canada and a First Nation, everyone's kind of like, how much money did you get? Oh my goodness, look at the per capita allocation that's going to the chief or the councillor, or how much are you paying that economic development officer? So we did a little bit of work in terms of what's the cost of actually delivering those types of services in these kind of regions. We're talking about, in many cases, hundreds if not thousands of kilometers away from easy access to services. You're talking about very difficult challenges, very difficult circumstances, and in many cases the critical mass of people who can do those jobs are very attractive, and so they're being chased by the federal government. So you're competing against federally subsidized salaries and benefits. So of course on the other side it's going to cost more. So we actually did an analysis saying, if you were going to do this kind of structure in the environment looks like Northern Ontario, here's the salaries you should expect. And they weren't that far off from what you see in these standard agreements and that type of thing. Now, of course, the media loves to pick on them, but they pick on federal salaries, they pick on provincial salaries. Everybody loves the sunshine list, right? But the simple fact is, it costs money to get talent. So that was one of the things we looked at. There's a whole paper on looking at the analysis of that cost. The other flip side was the modern trend, and I think it's a positive one, around equity ownership, and the idea that it's not just giving access to a revenue stream, but actually giving access to ownership and decision making. So a real kind of in-depth discussion about what's the difference between, here's a dollar allocation of the value or the cost or whatever, instead of here's your role in participating, here's how you get to make a decision about what's the next investment that this company makes, what does this company look like, not just 5 years from now, but 15 years from now.
So what's the process if someone wanted a research paper, your involvement at NPI and doing the, can you just outline what was the process in getting someone comes to you with an idea, with a sponsorship, to do a certain research project? How does that all work? Do you take anyone that's thrown at you, or you just say, no, we can't touch that, that's too hot? How does that work?
Well, I haven't done a lot on the Ring of Fire, I can tell you that. So we have a set of questions that we kind of look at whenever anybody comes to us, whether it's a municipality or I was talking to Confederation College just the other day about a possible partnership. So yeah, it has to fit into a major public policy issue. One of my favorite examples of that is I've got a friend of mine who runs a free market think tank, is what it's called, in Winnipeg, and he spends a lot of time on taxi licensing. And it's an important issue in Winnipeg, but for me, taxi licensing really isn't a major kind of policy issue, although weirdly enough, just yesterday it came up in a conversation we were having with Kenora. So that kind of is the structure. Is it an important public policy issue? Can we make a difference? So the Ring of Fire, for example, everybody and their mother was writing about it when we first got going in 2014, 2015. So it really made no sense for MPI to work in that area. There was just too many other people answering it, and many of them had way more resources than we had. And the third thing is, can we find the resources? You have to be able to find someone who's got a certain expertise in that field. And it's tough sometimes to find that expertise. We've got several transportation projects going. It took me almost a year and a half to find a couple of analysts who could work in that field. So that's kind of the way it approaches. The other thing that's important is we're not like a consulting company. So you can't come to us and say, we want to do this, so we need you to make the case that says that's why we should do this. That's not the kind of question we answer. If you come to us and you say, we've got this problem, and we want to know what the right answer is to it, then we can partner with you to find the answer. So we can go and we can look at best practices. So for example, if you say, my council's trying to figure out if we're going to build a recreation center, or if we're going to invest in a small mall as a hub to attract private business. So we can say, okay, well, let's look at, 8 or 10 communities that look like yours across the country. 3 of them decided not to do it, 5 of them decided to do it. Did it work out? Did it not work out? Here's kind of the lessons. And then you can take that back, and that's the answer. And the other thing, of course, is we don't do work for hire. So it's a partnership as opposed to a sponsorship or a purchase of fee for service. So we'll put in a certain amount of dollars, you'll put in a certain amount of dollars. Sometimes communities come to us and they don't necessarily have resources. So for example, we looked at the question of whether or not Timmins needed a bricks and mortar university. But the Economic Development Agency there had about $7,500 to kind of look into the project. So not nearly enough money, but what they had was access to data. They had information about services, demand, they had information on trends in the economic sector in terms of who was investing, what jobs were coming. And so we agreed we'd pick up the hard costs, they'd share the data, and together we did an analysis that basically said, no, Timmins doesn't need a bricks and mortar university. What it needs is to expand remote delivery of other programs by other universities and institutions. And that's what they've done for the last decade. They've pursued that strategy, and so now there's almost 3 times as many opportunities to take post-secondary training in Timmins as there was when we started that project.
And so when it comes to elections, when people are involved in elections, where does NPI land on that one? Do they get involved in, is there a certain blackout time where you don't analyze policies prior to election? Or
so certainly media is eager for us to comment on election platforms. As a general rule, we tend to avoid that. What we will do is before elections, we'll kind of do a summary of here is the issues that we've identified over the last 5 years that are important for the province or the federal government. So for example, we did with the Mowat Center before I think the 2016 provincial election. We essentially participated as a partner and said, from the perspective of Northern Ontario, here are 8 or 10 things that the next provincial government could do to make things better. And it's entirely up to the parties whether they borrow them, steal them, use them, ignore them. That's entirely their exercise. So we try to avoid direct commentary on platform planks. But at the same time, if we've got policy out there that says, here's what you should be doing on First Nations education, or here's the best practices related to newcomer arrivals. So we spend a lot of time talking about, for example, in the last federal election, policies around immigration.
Right. And what does the other peers consider your institute? Is it, or not peers, but other groups out there that have opinions to state about left wing, right wing, center? What is NPI? Is it more left? Or?
So it's interesting. Me personally, I came to NPI after working for and running what's considered a right-wing think tank. I did it for 13 years. Most of the people I hired were left-leaning, and for me, it's been quite freeing working at NPI. So we consciously model ourselves after the original C.D. Howe model. Most people accept that C.D. Howe out of Toronto is largely kind of philosophically open, I guess. Sometimes they'll go to the right, sometimes they'll go to the left. And that's what we try to do. We say, you know what, if you like big government, that's wonderful, but if big government's not the solution to this particular problem, then it's not the solution to this particular problem. And if big government is the solution to this particular problem, then don't talk to us about markets. So we try to go both ways. It's very freeing. It means that we have there's something called the Overton window, and that's the area in which governments can make kind of decisions. And from our perspective, because we can go left or right depending on what the evidence tells us to do, our Overton window is much bigger.
And on the Indigenous front, what are some of the public policy issues that are most interesting at this time that we could do a lot more work on, particularly from your vantage point?
So I think one of the biggest things for me is I've been here 12 years. I came out of Atlantic Canada where we spent a lot of time looking at the implications of urbanization and economic independence. Membertou has been a great example of how to kind of essentially take control of your own future. And one of the things that I found quite disturbing in Northern Ontario is the difference between Northeastern Ontario and Northwestern Ontario in terms of how things are going for First Nations people. If you look in northeastern Ontario, you've got StatsCan data, you've got provincial data, you've got tax filer data around income levels, that kind of thing. And what it tells us is female First Nations members in northeastern Ontario tend to outperform not just females, generally female First Nation members in southern Ontario, but the female cohort overall. So they're at or better than their counterparts in the general population. Males are still a little bit behind. We tend to kind of still, we tend towards careers that aren't necessarily reflective of overall high earning incomes. A lot of the ladies tend to work in government, so their salaries tend to be a little bit higher. But in the Northwest, it's a real challenge. You know, our First Nations population, even the female side, are not as employed. There's a higher level of unemployment. There's a lower level of income. There's a lower level of education. And I think to a certain extent, we need to take a look at one of the reasons we're so focused on transportation is if you look in the Northeast, they have a network, right? You have two options to get out of Timmins. If you're in Sioux Lookout, you have one option: go south or forget about it. And so that's a real challenge. And then you look at the population that we have in remote communities in the Northwest compared to truly remote air access only communities in the Northeast. And I think that's some of the challenges. And you know what scares me a lot is we look at those issues and we say, oh well, you know, we have to invest more in education. But maybe it's not the education. Maybe it's the ability to access the education. You know, and maybe it's the ability to access healthcare treatment. I had a fascinating meeting with the folks from NAN the other day, the transportation sector, and they were talking about the number of times that planes fly in and can't land in remote communities, and the number of times the planes are on the ground and can't take off. Think about that. If you need an emergency surgery and you simply can't get out, or you're having a baby and now you're having it on the tarmac instead of having it in the hospital. And that has long-term implications, right? Long-term health implications, etc. So I think for me, that's one of the things is we really need to take a look at what are the fundamental issues. You know, we can clearly improve those outcomes because we've done it in northeastern Ontario. So what's the difference? What are the things that are holding us back in the Northwest?
Yeah, based on some of the reports that you've been looking at or producing up to this point, is telecommunications still a major issue in the West compared to the East? Or?
Telecommunications is a major issue everywhere.
Okay.
You know, Starlink certainly has been, well, I don't want to say a game changer because it's interesting. You talk to the folks using Starlink and it's hit or miss. And it's nice to know that Rogers is now getting into the business, so we're going to start to see a little competition. Remember, I've got a free market bent somewhere around there, so I like that idea of competition. But my cell phone doesn't work in 3/4 of the region when I'm traveling around. I spend a lot of time on the road, so I can, you know, I go into a T-Bay-Tel outlet, not to pick on T-Bay-Tel because they're not alone, but you know they've got all these little communities, we service this, and I'm like, no. So that's a real problem. So absolutely, we need to invest, and it's typical government, right? So we set a standard. The CRTC set a standard in 1995. That's 30 years ago, and we're still trying to get 100% of us to that 30-year-old standard. And I'm kind of like, wait a minute. If you know that it's been 30 years and you still haven't built it, why are you building a 30-year-old standard? Why are we not building the modern standard? So the CRTC goal in 95 was 50 up and 10 down. Let's not get too technical, but it's 50 and 10. In Europe, it's 130. So let's build 130. Why are we in communities building 50-10 infrastructure that's 30 years old that we already know we're 20 years behind? Let's build for today's standard, and that way when you come back in 25 years, we'll only be 10 years behind.
So getting back to the First Nation community, if they wanted to, let's say there was a local committee in the community that wants to do a public review or review of some of the policies enacted by the First Nation on their people in the community. So would that be something that would be looked at by NPI as well?
So we're happy to have any conversation.
Okay.
Simplest thing to do is call me or email me, and we'll have a chat about it. In many cases, what we try to do is we prefer to avoid descriptive analysis, and we're much more oriented towards, okay, so you know you've got a problem, let's do a description of what it is, and then let's talk about how to solve it. And in many cases, we like doing that because it gives us the opportunity to do case studies to say, okay, this community had this issue, here's 4 or 5 best practices, and then they can try it. And then 4 or 5 years from then, we can take a look and say, did it work or didn't work? And then other communities who might have similar issues, whether they're in the Northeast, the Northwest, whether they're in BC, can look at that and say, yeah, that worked for them, let's give it a go.
Yeah. And some of your research is based on qualitative and quantitative research, mostly qualitative?
There's no question that you have to have both.
Okay.
So we do a lot of time trying to get quantitative information, but at the same time, if you don't have the qualitative context, the lived experience to kind of put that in perspective, you're just going to end up with the same cookie cutter solutions that the guy in the basement in Toronto can come up with.
Okay. I got to ask you, this is a little bit off track, but AI, how does that impact on the work that you do?
So I have to admit, I'm 56 years old, and I don't have a lot of I worry a lot about AI. I worry a lot about AI because, my career has basically focused almost entirely on local level analysis, looking at the difference between small rural communities, small cities, and the overall national trends. And I worry that AI is sort of kind of bringing us to the tyranny of the majority by default, because AI is based on computer analysis of trends. So what gets said the most often becomes the AI solution. And there's been a lot of cases, at least in my career, where what got said the most often was the wrong thing to say. And so I worry a bit that we might find ourselves kind of trapped into groupthink because we've allowed our brains to be led down the garden path by AI. Don't get me wrong, I love AI. It's great to kind of, I see people every day speeding up the process of writing press releases and doing kind of documents, but I worry that if the computer writes the presentation for you, have you really thought it through? And you're the person ultimately sitting at the council table making the decision, right?
Okay. Is there anything that we missed that we should know about NPI before we close?
I think the big thing about NPI that's a little different than other institutions is that we're here. We're in the community. We'll come to you. Invite us. We'll go anywhere. We're happy to sit down. We love to have experience and see policy in action on the ground, because it's those images that go into the stories that then have the impact that change the direction.
Great. Excellent interview. Thank you very much for coming in and joining us and sharing. And who do we call? How can we get more information about NPI? Where do we go?
So first off, thanks for the invitation to come in.
Right.
It's great to chat with you. It's not the first time you and I have chatted, but it's the first time in this format. And the easiest way is just info@northernpolicy.ca. And you can get all of our publications just by taking a look at the website, northernpolicy.ca. You can follow us on Facebook. I think we're still on X. Don't know why, but I guess we're still there. Instagram. We did some fancier stuff, but it's the younger people that guide that thing.
Good. So we're talking with Charles Cirtwill. He's the president CEO for Northern Policy Institute, and that's a non-profit organization.
Federally
right?
registered charity for education purposes. That's right.
And it's funded probably by...
So we don't get a base grant from anybody
Okay.
at all. So it's all project driven. So, the Know the North project that we do, NOHFC was supporting that for about 10 years. Now FedNor is kind of the principal donor. We've got support from Agnico Eagle that's just come on board, a lot of private donations. So it's a blended mix, which is good and bad. It means that I have a lot of time raising money, but at the same time, if someone gets mad at me and decides not to give us their check that year, it's not that bad.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Take care.
That concludes another episode of the Prosperity Podcast with your host, Brian Davey, focusing on economic empowerment in Northern Ontario. Subscribe, rate, and comment to support Indigenous entrepreneurship. Remember, when we grow together, we all prosper. Stay inspired, stay innovative, and let's keep prospering together.
This video serves as general information. While we strive to offer accurate and current information, we do not provide any express or implied warranties regarding the completeness, accuracy, reliability, or suitability of the information presented in this video for your specific circumstances. Any reliance you place on this information is entirely at your own risk. We strongly recommend consulting a qualified professional before making decisions based on the content provided in this video too. Ensure it aligns with your unique situation.